So, what exactly happens when we die? I mean, it's the ultimate human question, right? For as long as we've had consciousness, we've kind of stared into that great unknown of death and wondered, what is waiting for us on the other side? Is it an actual place? A feeling? Maybe a final judgment? Or is it just a void?
Well, welcome to this explainer, Visions of the Afterlife. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this today. We're going to dive deep into the vast, mysterious, and honestly beautifully complex ways different cultures visualize life after death. So let's jump right in and see how we humans have tried to map out eternity.
Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever caught yourself wondering what actually happens when our breathing completely stops and our heart just stops beating? It's pretty much the ultimate human mystery. Every single year, thousands of people are medically declared dead, only to be revived moments later. And what's wild is that so many of them come back with these absolutely incredible stories to tell. Today, we're not dealing with myths or superstitions. We are strictly looking at the pure science, pulling from neuroscience, cardiology, and even quantum physics to figure out the exact mechanics of what happens at the very edge of life. Let's get right into it. So here is the core question we're tackling today. Does our consciousness, our entire sense of self, just permanently disappear the second our physical body shuts down? Or is that moment actually just the beginning of a whole new chapter? To figure this out, we really have to look closely at what people are experiencing when they cross that threshold and manage to come back.
Okay, part 1. The Quest for Eternity. Let's travel back thousands of years to ancient Egypt, and let me tell you, they did not leave eternity to chance. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't just some vague, mystical hope. No, it was a concrete, logistical process met with absolute bureaucratic mechanics. Reaching eternity was basically an intricate, heavily planned project that you and your whole community had to pull off to avoid fading into oblivion.
Which brings us to part 2, navigating the Egyptian underworld.
So what did this massive logistical project actually involve? Well, there were 3 huge hurdles every soul had to clear. First up, mummification. You literally had to preserve the physical body because it acted as an anchor for the spirit to return to. Once the body was safe, step 2 was the incredibly dangerous journey through the underworld, known as the duat. And step 3, the ultimate test, the weighing of the heart. Let's zoom in on that second step for a second.
The duat was definitely not a walk in the park. It was this terrifying realm accessed right through the tomb, packed with gates, doors, and pylons. And here's the absolute wildest part. These gates were guarded by dangerous deities, and to get past them, your soul had to know literal passwords. You had to pronounce the true, secret name of the guardian. And we're not talking about friendly bouncers here. We're talking about terrifying figures with names like He Who Dances in Blood.
So, how on earth were you supposed to remember all those passwords? Well, you brought a cheat sheet. It's so fascinating to see how these afterlife texts evolved over time. Originally, you had the pyramid texts, spells literally carved into stone, but totally exclusive to Old Kingdom royals. But as time went on, this magic got democratized. By the Middle Kingdom, we see coffin texts, making these secret passwords accessible to everyday people who could afford a coffin. And finally, in the New Kingdom, we get the whole shebang, the famous Book of the Dead, an extensive papyrus collection of spells to guide absolutely anyone who had it through the dangers of the duat. Moving on to part 3, Judgment and the Afterlife. Let's say you had your cheat sheet and you actually made it past the demons. Now you arrive at the dramatic climax of the journey. You enter the Hall of Ma'at. Ma'at was the Egyptian concept of truth, justice, and universal balance, and it was famously represented by a single ostrich feather. Picture this intensely high-stakes scene. You are standing before 42 divine judges. You have to swear to all the sins you didn't commit in life. Then, the jackal-headed god Anubis takes your actual heart and puts it on a glowing scale right opposite the feather of Ma'at. If your heart was light, meaning it was free of the heavy burden of sin, you were granted this beautiful, miraculous restoration. As the Book of the Dead promises, I unite your limbs, I surround your flesh, I heal all your limbs. I mean, your body and soul are completely restored for eternity. But if your heart was heavier than the feather, it was instantly devoured by a terrifying goddess named Emmet. Your soul would just permanently cease to exist. Game over, a true second death.
But for the folks who passed, the ultimate reward was 𝐂𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿, the field of reeds. And this perfectly captures what paradise meant to the ancient Egyptians. Forget clouds and harps. It was essentially an idealized, flawless version of their everyday agricultural life. A lush, fertile paradise with waterfalls and eternal access to their beloved Nile River, where you could farm, feast, and commune with the gods forever.
All right, let's jump forward to Part 4, Modern Near-Death Experiences. We've seen how the ancient world practically treated eternity like a massive, physical, geographical expedition. Now I want you to completely reset your mental framework. Forget the physical preparations. What do we see today? When modern people brush right up against death, what are they actually reporting?
Okay, let's set the stage here. A near-death experience, or NDE, typically happens when a patient is brought to the absolute brink of death due to a severe medical emergency. Think a massive cardiac arrest, severe trauma, or a deep coma, and then they're subsequently revived. What's truly staggering about these events is their consistency. Seriously, whether a patient is from India, the US, or Japan, the stories they tell are remarkably similar. Back in 1975, Dr. Raymond Moody studied thousands of these patients and identified these universal, global patterns. We're talking about patients consistently reporting an out-of-body experience where they literally float above themselves. Then there's the classic traveling through a dark tunnel toward an intense bright light, a rapid life review where their entire existence flashes before their eyes in seconds, meeting deceased loved ones, and finally reaching a boundary, like a point of no return. But the real puzzle is, how on earth are patients experiencing all of this when their brain and heart have supposedly shut down completely?
Section 2. The Neuroscience of NDEs.
Well, mainstream neuroscience points strictly to the biology of a dying brain to explain all this. According to research from the University of Michigan conducted in 2013 and 2023, when cardiac arrest happens and oxygen stops flowing to the brain doesn't just quietly turn off. No way. Instead, right before death, there's what's called a gamma wave surge. Now, gamma waves are the absolute fastest brain waves we have. They're heavily associated with high-level consciousness, memory, and intense information processing. So at the exact moment of death, the brain actually becomes hyperactive. This massive final electrical jolt perfectly explains why that life review feels so unbelievably vivid and hyper-real to the patient.
And then we have hypoxia. This is a severe lack of oxygen to the brain. When the brain is starved of oxygen, the visual cortex begins to heavily distort. Basically, this physiological failure causes darkness to start creeping into the sides of our vision, leaving only a bright spot of light right in the center. As you can probably guess, this perfectly mimics that famous tunnel vision effect that almost all NDE survivors talk about. Finally, there's the chemical cocktail. At the moment of death, the human body is under extreme physical stress. To block out the sheer pain of it all, the brain releases a massive flood of endorphins, which induces a feeling of extreme peace and euphoria. Plus, many scientists believe the brain's pineal gland releases DMT. That's a highly powerful, naturally occurring hallucinogen. This immense chemical release could very well be exactly what causes these intense, alternate dimension visual hallucinations.
Section 3. Anomalies. Science cannot explain.
Now, if NDEs are purely just brain chemistry and biological misfires, the story really should end right there, right? But it doesn't. There are documented medical anomalies, literal glitches in the matrix that leave even the most seasoned neuroscientists completely baffled. Consider a concept called veridical perception. This is when a patient accurately observes real events while clinically dead. Take the incredibly famous 1991 case of Pam Reynolds. During a highly complex brain surgery, her body's blood was literally drained, her brain waves were completely flatlined, and her ears were tightly plugged. She was, by all biological measures, completely shut down. Yet upon being revived, she accurately described the exact, highly specific shape of the surgical instruments being used. She even perfectly repeated the private conversations the doctors were having during the procedure. Honestly, how is that biologically possible?
Oh, and it gets even more mysterious. Look at Dr. Kenneth Ring's astonishing findings involving congenitally blind people. We're talking about individuals who have been totally blind since birth. They have never seen a single visual thing in their entire normal lives. Now, even a hallucination relies on the brain recalling previously seen images, right? Yet during their near-death experiences, these blind patients perfectly described seeing brilliant colors, bright lights, and their physical surroundings. It's truly mind-blowing. And this is further backed up by the massive AWARE study, led by Dr. Sam Parnia. This extensive research showed that patients were retaining accurate visual memories of their resuscitation room several minutes after full cardiac arrest. Just to put that into perspective, we are talking about a period where brain function was at absolute zero. No electrical activity, no blood flow, literally nothing.
Which takes us to part 5, cultural differences in NDEs. Because while that baseline is the same, the details of these experiences radically change depending on where you grew up. And this is incredibly revealing. In Western NDEs, people almost always report seeing a bright light, but they interpret it as a being of light, a deeply personal entity radiating irresistible warmth, love, and acceptance. But then you look at the Japanese reports. They saw bright light too, but they viewed it as totally impersonal. To them, it was just a bright light. No personality, no overwhelming warmth, and absolutely zero interaction with it. And here is another massive contrast. Think about the classic life review. In Western NDEs, it's super common for people to say their life flashed before their eyes, a panoramic review of their past actions, usually weighing their personal morality. Yet in the Japanese cases studied by Okado and Greisen, this panoramic life review is completely absent, literally zero reports of it.
And that brings us to part 6, a culturally shaped beyond. Let's tie all of this together. What all these sources are ultimately showing us is that the afterlife is a profound mirror of the culture that envisions it. The ancient Egyptians valued the Nile, farming, and strict bureaucratic order, so their eternity was a lush farm with divine bouncers demanding passwords. Modern Westerners, raised in a culture hyper-focused on personal deities and individual morality, encounter a loving being of light and go through a moral life review. Meanwhile, Japanese experiencers, coming from entirely different spiritual frameworks, hit the exact same biological baseline but filter it through their own cultural lens, seeing an impersonal light and skipping the life review entirely. Basically, our backgrounds heavily shape our vision of eternity.
Section 4. Quantum Physics and Consciousness. This brings us to a massive scientific crossroad. If the biological brain is completely flatlined and shut down, how in the world are these visual and auditory perceptions actually happening? To answer that, some physicists turn to the quantum realm. Allow me to introduce you to the Orch-OR theory, proposed by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Sir Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff. Their theory suggests a pretty radical idea, that consciousness is not just a mere byproduct of neural activity in the brain. Instead, they argue that our consciousness is actually stored at the quantum level, safely inside tiny structures in our brain cells called microtubules. Let's walk through the exact physics of their argument, step by step, because it's fascinating. First, the physical body begins to die. Second, as a result, the quantum state of these brain microtubules begins to break down. However, and this is key, the first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So step 3, the quantum information of our consciousness doesn't die, it simply dissipates into the wider universe. Finally, step 4, if the patient is successfully revived by doctors, that quantum information snaps right back into the brain, and the patient wakes up saying, "I just had a near-death experience." But if they die, that quantum information simply continues to exist out there in the cosmos. Section 5, the ultimate takeaway. So, we find ourselves weighing two highly compelling camps here. On one hand, biological science tells us that NDEs are a brilliant defense mechanism, basically chemical dumps designed to make our final moments peaceful. On the other hand, complex quantum physics and verifiable out-of-body experiences heavily suggest that consciousness is energy, and it's not strictly limited to our physical brain. But here is what you should really take away from this. Regardless of which scientific camp you fall into, the outcome for the survivor is just incredibly beautiful. People who return from a near-death experience are fundamentally changed. They report a complete permanent loss of the fear of death. They suddenly possess a much deeper love for life, a massive reduction in materialistic desires, and this overwhelming increase in empathy and compassion for others. The mechanics might be debated forever, but that human transformation, that is incredibly real. Science is still working relentlessly to solve this puzzle, but one thing is absolutely certain. Death may not be a hard stop, but rather a profound transition that we just don't have the tools to fully measure yet. I want to leave you with this thought to weigh for yourself, based on the evidence we explored in our explainer today. Are near-death experiences simply a brilliant chemical illusion generated by a dying brain, or are they the ultimate, quantum proof of a journey that extends far beyond our physical bodies?
Which leaves us with this final, honestly amazing question. If our minds literally build the architecture of our eternity using the tools of the culture we know in life, what will your afterlife look like? It's just a completely fascinating mystery about the sheer power of human consciousness. And, well, it's one we are all going to discover for ourselves eventually. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep wondering, and I'll see you next time.